All right, let's talk about this concept, though, which I think often is the barrier to ceasefires, which is the suspicion that that time will simply be used by either side or one side as a rearming, retooling, re-strategizing moment. So, the first way I want to approach this is, how is that discussed in your research? I mean, is it a formal discussion, or is it just sort of an agreement that, hey, we know this is a risk, and but we feel like both sides have to take that now to have any step towards peace? It seems to be one of the strongest barriers to getting to any ceasefire is that suspicion that it's just going to be exploited. Talk a little bit about how you've seen that handled in those early negotiations, and then what practically happens in the midst of most ceasefires.
So yeah, parties will always try and use the ceasefire to the ends that suit them the most. The way I've seen that play out in the ceasefires that I've looked at the most is via the negotiations, I guess, around the terms of the ceasefire. So I think a lot, in my opinion, I think negotiators spend a lot of time uh, thinking about the terms of the ceasefire, but often they're done quite by rote. There's actually a ceasefire drafter's handbook that's available, which literally has different terms that ceasefire negotiators can pull out and put into their whatever ceasefire they happen to be negotiating at any given time. So there's this idea, I think, in the mediation community that certain terms like around security sector reform or around demobilization of combatants or how far combatants are going to be away from each other, different things like that need to be included in ceasefires. And I think what my research says is that maybe that's true. Some of those terms do need to be included, but we also need to think more carefully and more in a more nuanced way about how those terms relate to the people on the ground, that those ceasefires who are most affected by those ceasefires. So, for example, humanitarian corridors or a humanitarian pause is a great example of that because we think by those words, we think, oh, great, it's nice, it's humanitarian, it's a corridor, it all sounds very nice on face value. But we know from different conflicts like Ukraine or even in Gaza, humanitarian corridors have been proposed. And in Ukraine, they were proposed by Putin, but those corridors led from Mariupol, to a Russian territory or to Belarus, or they weren't safe for people to go along in the first place. So they weren't agreed to in Ukraine, even though they were proposed. Similarly, in Gaza, humanitarian corridors have, completely displaced people, often multiple times in that conflict. So they're not. I guess my research says, look, these things might sound good on face value, but we have to actually look at their practical consequences for the people most affected. And kind of, it's very then obvious in my mind to come to the conclusion that these things aren't always humanitarian and positive.
You mentioned there's sort of a handbook. Is that is there like a formal documentation of, based on lessons learned throughout the decades of these are best practices for ceasefires?
I guess that was why it was compiled. I think it's available online if people want to. You can Google it and probably find it. I think it was compiled with that in mind. I mean, it's definitely something that was compiled at that sort of international level for mediators who are working more on that sort of international plane rather than for local ceasefires. But I think it probably trickles down to that level as well. And I guess, yeah, it was thought of as, look, these are the things that over time mediators have felt that we need to include. And like I said, that may be true to a certain extent, but what my research tries to do is uh, sort of question that a little bit more and ask mediators to really think about the consequences of those terms for the people most affected.